Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. You may hear the chimes from our bell tower in the background. It's 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to share my screen with you to kind of go through this as a PowerPoint, and then we'll, with any time remaining in the half hour, we'll explore the data in the portal. If you have any questions, you can put them through the chat. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. So today's topic is really going to be how to use the web portal to pick peers and to do benchmarking at the academic discipline level. And we'll also talk about other ways of choosing peers and some options that may be more useful to you. A little outline of what we're going to do looks like this. So we're going to talk about the sometimes relative poor alignment between a department or academic program and an institutional Carnegie classification. A case in point might be looking at a research high institution or highest institution such as University of Delaware, and a program such as anthropology, which offers a bachelor's degree as its highest degree awarding. So in that case, using a peer group that consists of doctoral or even master's granting institutions for anthropology may not be a very good alignment. There's not going to be any graduate instruction in the baccalaureate program, so resources that would go towards graduate instruction in the doctoral granting program are going to be focused elsewhere. So we can select peers in the web portal to answer that concern. We'll also talk about a little bit about reporting and how you can sometimes put together a nice view of a department with 4 or 5 key performance indicators and metrics placed within a distribution that you've obtained from your exploration in the web portal. So let's move on a little bit to a question that may come from your initial exploration in the web portal is, if you look at each department and the sort of second page that follows the data submission, you'll see that there's a 3-year average for the productivity and cost metrics available. And that can kind of give you a good idea of the relative position of your department compared to either the Carnegie national norm, the norm by the highest degree, or the proportion of undergrad to total degrees awarded. But frequently we want to try to do a more fine-tuned kind of analysis at the departmental level. So we'll look at that. Now, I wanted to provide some context here, and the context is that we've looked at how programs differ from one another, and this slide represents a summary of research that we did with Kevin Stang at the University of Michigan and Steve Hemmel at the University of North Carolina. And what you'll notice is that if you compare the relative cost of instruction for 19 disciplines with English, that there's some regular patterns that occurs, and in many cases you'll see that many disciplines are more expensive to teach. You see electrical engineering down on the end. In all Carnegie configurations is more expensive to teach, but that in some cases there's some interesting deviations from that. So for example, in accounting, you'll see that although it's more expensive to teach accounting for most types of programs, for private baccalaureates, it's actually less expensive. So knowing that, we might say, well, we want to look at, if we're at a private baccalaureate, we might want to look at comparable accounting programs because they don't really fit the overall pattern that you might see just using national norm data. So we're going to go to the portal, and in the portal, if you first start out with the reports page on your home page, you'll be able to find a list of CIPs that were reported for the year. Now, I just highlighted this because sometimes we skip past this information, but in the 2017 year, there were a total of 783 specific 6-digit level CIPs that were reported to the cost study. And I just have a beginning of the list there. Out of that 783, we roll up at the 4-digit level to 278 specific 4-digit CIPs. So about 36% of that total when we've done the roll up. So that means that there's a fair amount of aggregation at the discipline level that occurs. And so you want to be able to fine tune your data to the circumstances that most accurately align with your particular department. For example, in accounting, to stay with the accounting example, in that large group there of 6-digit CIPs, there's 5 specific CIPs at the 6-digit level that describe accounting, and you can see that they have different foci, finance, business management, other types of accounting emphasis that are differentiated within the CIP codes, but these all get aggregated at 5203. So perhaps you may know something about your peers and want to select them based on specific knowledge of the departments at institutions that are like yours. So you go to the peer analysis tab in the web portal, and you'll see that under that you can request a peer analysis. The conditions are that you have to include at least 10 institutions in your selection. This is to protect the confidentiality and security and anonymity of any individual department. And so you'll go to this drop-down set of menus, and you'll see that you can search for specific institutions because there's nearly 200 potential institutions to select from. You could enter in where it says institution name, a state, for instance, and all the participants that have that state in the name of them will show up. But you can also select by CIP, so that if you're focusing on a departmental comparison, such as our accounting example, you can just use that drop down to select a particular CIP, and then you'll see all of the institutions listed that submitted data for that area in the study year. You also see that there's a space to name your peer group so that you can really submit unlimited number of peer requests. Now we take a look at them, and again, the emphasis here is on providing anonymity and data security. And so although we will accept most peer requests, if there's any indication that a combination might reveal the identity of one specific department, we would have to decline to go along with that request, and we would work with you to try to come up with a suitable modification. But yeah, we have to try to keep in mind that some of the data in the cost study is sensitive, especially the finance data, and so we act accordingly. So you'll see that if I put in institution name SUNY, that right away the 4 institutions that have that in their institution name are immediately provided to us. Now this example we had also selected English. So to go back to the accounting example, here's a partial list of everybody that had submitted data in 2017 for accounting, and you'll see that it starts out in alphabetical order and goes down. Also gives you the FICE code and what the Carnegie class is. So you can then use the little check boxes off on the left to select the group that you're most interested in for your comparison. And in this example, I thought, well, let's take a look at some of the smaller, mostly private baccalaureate-focused schools and see what the accounting data looks like. So you'll see I put in the name of this peer group as accounting number 1, and I picked primarily smaller baccalaureate or privately controlled governed institutions. So this example is something anyone could do. You could also do this group and then say, well, let's take a look at how that compares to just masters that are publics or masters that are private. And that gives you a way of fine-tuning the overall metrics that you're going to get from the results to actually match as much as is possible the characteristics of your department. So you'll see that the next thing to do is to submit your peer request, and then you'll get a choice of CIPs again and particular ratio tables, either the table 1 and 2 that show the percent of instruction by faculty type or by class level, tables 3, which are the productivity metrics, cost, the student credit hours per FTE faculty member and class sections per FTE faculty member, and then table 4, which is the cost per student credit hour and per FTE student, as well as the research and public service information. So here you'll see the results of the peer query, and you'll see that you get a listing of who is in the requested peer group. You see the name at the top, accounting number 1, and the names of the specific peers that were included here. Now, what's nice about this, and I may shift over to a view of the portal itself, is that you can sort this by column. So, for instance, if you wanted to just sort by total faculty that are in the department, you'll see that in the first few rows, there's quite a variety of sizes. We have one that has a very small faculty, and the next one down has 9 members, as opposed to not even 1 FTE in the first one. So you can take this data and sort it by column. You could start out with, well, I want to look at the highest priced per credit hour or the lowest priced per student. You could also, if you were interested, look at the amount of research and or public service funding per faculty member. Now, the first few rows that are visible here, there wasn't funding, which is not unusual for the Carnegie level of these institutions. A little further down on the screen, you would be able to see there were some that had some funding. Then you can copy this by, there's a radio button that you can click that says copy to clipboard, and then paste that into an Excel document so that all of this data can be downloaded in a fairly quick order just by pointing and clicking and using a little copying and pasting. Here's what it looks like when you put this particular set of ratio files into an Excel document, and you'll see that I did not try to sort it in any particular way, but you'll see there's one institution that had some research funding down here on the second to the last row. You'll also get the number that were in the particular peer group selection, the cost per credit hour. In this case, it was $262. The standard deviation was about $90. And so that tells you that there's some variability among these. And you can then also just inspect the data and see, yes, of course, there's one here that the cost per credit hour was nearly half of the group average at about $116, much less than the $262. There weren't any outliers as defined by our methodology, which is to look at the standard deviation and go 2 standard deviations above or below the average to identify outliers. So in this case, there were no outliers for cost per student credit hour or cost per FTE student. It appears there was an outlier in the category that is the direct instructional expense as a percent of the total instructional expense. And that generally is somehow there's a program that was that had a larger amount of non-personnel expenditure. Maybe it was a more technologically focused accounting approach. And you see that the standard deviation of 0.06, if you double that and you get down to 0.12 below 95, you see this 86, I think, or sorry, here this 78 appears to be the outlier. So they must have been spending more for non-personnel costs. So that's the sort of information you get. Now you can take this, and this is a fairly small group, but you could fine-tune it even more. You could select only the programs that did not offer any graduate instruction, for instance. There's 5 here that offer master's degrees, and maybe you say, well, that's not really consistent with our offering. And so then you could take that data and recompute any metric that you thought was better focused by eliminating the rows of the data that aren't consistent with your program. Now, you can select from the option that's not available in the web portal to have all of your programs benchmarked at the institutional level. This goes back to our more traditional approach towards peer analyses. And you would basically just send us a list of at least 10 institutions of your choosing, and we'll produce a peer analysis that has some nice features in that you'll get a summary table for each of the cost study metrics, and you'll also get the raw data, the ratio files that are similar to the ones that we were just looking at, and of course a list of your peers that were selected. So if you are sometimes in a situation where you are finding that an institution level comparison is really ideal, maybe you don't really see that there's that much difference between the programs at your institution and your Carnegie classification. This is one approach that you're still offered by the cost study. The results would look something like this. Here you'll see that in this example, we used all of the master's large Carnegie participants, and in matching to a particular institution, you'll see that there was the largest comparison that's visible on the screen was in mathematics, that 27 of the master's large offered a math program. The smallest was journalism, which is CIP 0.904, and there were only 5 in that category, as was the case with family and consumer sciences. So the drawback to this is that you'll get everything that we have in a particular group, such as this master's large Carnegie group, but we can't really be sure that you'll have very many in each of the particular CIP areas. So it's a little bit less certain that you'll get the number that you're looking for. And you'll see that although we require a minimum of 10 in the initial group that's submitted, if we have at least 5 in a particular CIP, they will be reported. So the minimum required for entering a request for a sort of institution level comparison is 10, but we will report if there are as few as 5 in a particular CIP. Now this is table 4, so you again see cost per student credit hour per FTE student, the same metrics that were in the ratio files, but here we see, because it's a master's granting group, there's more activity in the research and public service area. And of course, this is just a partial listing. I didn't want to try to squeeze the entire table 4 onto the page because it was quite a bit more lengthy than what's showing here. Now, there's another way you can select peers, and this is a method that requires a little additional work. And if you find that you'd be interested in this, my colleague T. Yan has done a lot of work in this area. This is an example of a peer that was selected using the data from the cost study. And what we did was we used data from multiple years of the study and then used a naive Bayesian method to assign similar programs to the same cluster from the 2015 study year in this example. And you'll see that when you use a data-driven approach, you might get some surprises. In this case, the surprises were that although most of these are research high and highest R1 and R2 institutions, there's also some R3 and some master's large schools in the cluster, which is basically saying that in any group that you use data-driven methods for, there's going to be some established peers and some aspirational peers. And so the data can reveal that to you, which is sometimes useful because although we often have a set of peers that are given to us from leadership, sometimes the data will produce that in the field there's actually some interesting things happening. So if you're interested in a peer selection by using a data-driven approach, let us know and we can talk with you more about that. I find this particularly useful when we have a very large area of program activity, such as English or mathematics, and we know that some departments are in fact different than others, and we're looking at what is it that we may not see from an overt view of the data that can be revealed through using some latent class analysis modeling to try to look for some underlying similarities that may not be obvious based on the specific metrics that are available. Another way that we recommend using peer analyses is to take the information and place your department within a distribution. And for instance, I'm showing the outline of a box whisker plot. As an example, here's one way that we summarize multiple metrics in a single screen. You can see this is data drawn over a 4-year period, and we summarize the cost per student credit hour, the size of the faculty, how much teaching is being done by lower division faculty, how much teaching in terms of credit hours, that is being done at the upper division, and then how much graduate instruction is done. The use of using several years and a box whisker plot ensures that you provide context, and you can see in this example that the expense is fairly high for this example. They're around the 75th percentile in cost per student credit hour, and their faculty size is relatively large, somewhere between the 50th and 75th percentile. Now, there are some outliers. T has done this particular example in Tableau, which allows you to highlight the outliers and remove them from the distribution, and then you get a reconfigured distribution that may be somewhat less compacted by the presence of outliers. In the lower division teaching, you can see that this department is somewhat below the median, and in some cases even closer to the 25th percentile. The same with upper division and graduate teaching. So this particular view says, yeah, you're expensive per credit hour, and partly the reason is because you're not teaching near the average for similar departments that you used in this peer comparison. Now, of course, if you chose a different peer group, the picture could be changed considerably, and also the presence or removal of outliers might have some effect. Sometimes having this sort of very compact summarized data that shows information over time really saves a lot of wondering about whether the picture is stable and whether it's consistent. Here's another example of a similar kind of analysis, but in this case we added to it the idea of data envelopment analysis and an efficiency number. Now, in contrast to that last example, we've got the same comparisons within this time a peer group that was drawn by using a sophisticated approach to data-driven peer group selection. So you can see that this looks much better in comparison to the last slide, because the size of the faculty is among the lowest in this peer group. The cost per student credit hour is only around the 25th or 30th percentile. This is a much more compacted distribution. So this would indicate that in this peer group, all of the comparators are relatively close to each other, although there are some important differences. And then, the teaching that's occurring at the undergraduate level is close to the say 60th percentile. Now we're only around the 25th percentile for upper division teaching, but their graduate teaching is well above the 75th percentile. And so you might say, well, yeah, this department seems to do pretty well compared to its peers. It might do even better if it could increase some of activity in the upper division teaching. So it's hopefully instructive to have a very specific look at a selected group of comparators and a selection of key performance indicators that can all be presented on one page. Now, the next time we talk, we're going to go into some detail about the use of data envelopment analysis to facilitate efficiency and operational excellence. So we'll come back to what was observed here and how we get these efficiency numbers. And we can also talk more about the selection of comparators. In many cases, we end up relying on using the highest degree that's awarded in a discipline as a comparator group. The Carnegie group is useful, and it's been one of the more commonly requested peer analysis types over time. But I think partly it's because those requests come for a very high level sort of discussion of how do we look compared to some other institution. I'm going to promote the idea that departmental comparisons actually get more to the heart of the matter, because that's where the variability in cost is the most extreme and meaningful. So we've reached close to the end of the 30 minutes. If anybody has some specific questions or would like to go back to any of the earlier slides, I'm happy to do that. Perhaps if I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions in the chat. I haven't seen that. But I think everybody's speaker is open, so if you have a question, just go right up ahead and speak. Ask your question now. Oh, okay, here's a good question. Is there a grand list of institutions that have participated each year to determine peer institutions? The answer is yes. There's a place on our homepage, which I'll see if I can navigate to and share that in just a minute, that has that information. So it's actually available on our homepage as a download. So let me see if I can stop the share, and I'll do a new share. So I find my. So I'm going to share our homepage, and if we go down here, there's a complete list of participating institutions, and once you open it, you'll see that it's a rather lengthy list of over 700, and so that's not too useful. But right here is the complete list of institutions by year. Now, when I click on this, it's going to open up an Excel document, which I think I'll have to do a new share in order to show you. So let's see if I can finagle that while everybody's still here. And let's see. So it looks kind of like this, where you can go back to 1996, and it's an Excel document, so you can filter it and select the year that you're interested in. Now that's sort of useful if you're looking for something up to 2016, but the web portal peer analysis data is really in the portal. So let me show you what that looks like. Two things over. So hopefully you can see this right now. Active institutions for 2017 is quite useful, but then there's also active CIP for 2017, and then a combination. So my suggestion is you can indeed look here for all of the active institutions in 2017, but then you can zero in on a particular CIP by clicking on that link. Oh, I think we showed that that slide earlier. Let's see. It looks like the portal's taking a while to come up with this list. So I'm going to try to switch over to here and share this instead. Yeah, back here on this slide is a list of all of the institutions by CIP that had accounting. Unfortunately, the web portal sometimes takes a while because if it's a lengthy list, such as the one that relates to accounting, it has to kind of go through and select all of the appropriate departments that were submitted by each institution. So, other questions in the chat, possibly? It says, in terms of looking at data-driven approaches to creating peer groups, is that something that we advise is typical, or is it separate consulting service offered by our team? It's really right now a service that we've offered just as a addition to the study when a question arises about, do we have a good fit? I had a conversation with our behavioral health and nutrition department chair yesterday, and that's a particularly interesting area because our program has a very strong emphasis on behavioral health and has moved away from including physical education as part of the curriculum. Many of our participants that submit data in the cost study for that same CIP include physical education. So it's a situation where I think it would be worthwhile for us to use a data-driven approach to try to say, okay, we suspect that there are some programs here that have phys ed as a fundamental part of the curriculum, and they teach a lot of credit hours in that, and there are others that do not. In addition, the department here at Delaware has a very strong research focus. So we would be using the data that includes research and public service expenditure to try to differentiate between programs that may be at a level that's below our immediate ability to observe, similar, and then we can use either just standard peer comparisons like the box whisker plots we showed, or we can go to a full data envelopment analysis. And we're happy if anyone's interested in the data-driven approach to explore situations where it really gives you an added insight into who are the appropriate peers for a specific department. So thank you for that question. Any other questions come to mind? We can either do it over the mics or we can just do it through chat. While we're sort of waiting to see if there's any others, I'm gonna, if you haven't seen this already, there was a nice summary of the research that we've done with our collaborators at Michigan and Chapel Hill that was published in MarketWatch just before our last webinar on February 13th, why it costs colleges far more to educate a physicist or teacher than an English major, which is a variation on the theme of why does it cost more to teach English than math. And if you haven't seen that, here is a link to the MarketWatch article. And I just want to thank you all for contributing to the study, because without your effort, we would not be able to provide a kind of link between the data from the cost study, which is used for our purposes for institutional planning and improvement, performance assessment, and kind of the larger public policy question about what is driving the costs of instruction, and why is it becoming so much more difficult for families and students to afford a four-year degree. We've actually been motivated by the results of this collaboration, and I'm gonna go back up to my slide that sort of summarizes this and show that again. We've taken this data and looked at the same time period in respect to the cost study. So if any of you are interested in a comparison for any of these 20 programs, actually it's really a comparison with between the 19 that are listed here in English. We've actually done a more detailed comparison using class size, workload, salaries, and the proportion of non-personnel expenditures. So I can offer that as an additional kind of benchmark. We'll be talking more about this in detail in the future. Right now it's data that we've just kind of accumulated and have begun to explore. So if that sounds interesting to you, let us know, and we'll certainly be happy to try to pull a specific analysis for one of these disciplines for your institution and look at how it compares on those four cost drivers. We think it's a potentially instructive additional benchmarking method, and until we have time to kind of fully vet it and explore some of the implications and also maybe better understand some of the reasons why these cost differences are summarized as you see in this slide. But we're kind of excited about having a new direction to try to use in getting to an analysis of what makes a program more expensive relative to English and relative to a national average. So unless anyone has any last minute questions, we're right at about 2:40, and I'm sure you all are probably ready to go back to the rest of your day. So I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And if you happen to be one of the people on the call that I might owe some correspondence, I apologize for being a little bit slow in getting back to you. We've been finishing up our data vetting here at UD, and we also were happy to have the opportunity to present a presentation at the American Council on Education annual conference earlier in the week in Philadelphia. So we've been running around a little bit, but again, thank you for your great work and your patience with me, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which will be about data and development analysis on April 4th. Thanks again, and have a great day.